to the Construction Big Breakfast, where we give you a hearty serving of insider tips and business strategies to help fuel your day so you can thrive in the construction industry. Now, here's your
Joining me
host.
for today's podcast is our special guests, Steve Webb, director and co-founder of Webb Yates, and Tom Webster, the director of Webb Yates. Welcome to the podcast, Steve and Tom. Can you give our listeners a little introduction to yourselves? Steve?
Tom, do you want to go first? Or should I? So I'm Steve Webb. Structural engineer. Me and Andy Yates founded Webb Yates 15 years ago. Very happy to be here. Thank you for having us on.
And Tom?
I'm Tom Webster. I've been with Webb Yates now since 2015. Previously to that, I was at ACOM, became director in 2016. And it's been onwards and upwards ever since then for the company, I think.
Awesome. Well, we're really excited to have you on. Now, as it's the Construction Big Breakfast, we do have to ask one very important question before we dive into the nitty-gritty of it. What did you have for breakfast today, Tom?
I had almonds, some sunflower seeds and some pumpkin seeds, a dollop of yogurt, a whole load of blueberries, and then I hoovered up my daughter's breakfast after her, which is toast.
Sounds pretty,
that's what I've had.
Healthy. How about yourself, Steve?
My daughter, whose diet is getting worse and worse, has a big packet of Crave. Have you ever had Crave? It's the perfect combination of salt, sugar, and fat. They're like little tortellinis of corn flour with chocolate on the inside, and really bad.
Sounds like a good way to boost your blood sugar
even call
levels.
them Crave. Just like
They're probably called Crave because you're becoming addicted to it.
I have to confess to that to counterpoint Tom's super healthy breakfast. But maybe he was stealing Crave from his daughter afterwards as well. I don't know.
Stealing Crave. It sounds like it should be illegal.
It is. Oh my God! It totally should be illegal. It should be. They should be taxing that stuff.
Cause of diabetes in the world. Daryl, how about for yourself? What'd you have for breakfast?
Well, compared to these two, I had something relatively boring. So I just had granola this morning and as usual, a nice cup of coffee.
Oh, nice. Okay. Well, for myself, I actually did a juice cleanse last week, which I hated every minute of it. I don't think our bodies are meant to only drink juice. So I've obviously been eating copious amounts of food since then. So I've made some low-fat muffins. I think they're called that just because I didn't use proper sugar, but probably still pretty bad for you. But I put figs and coconut and banana and rolled oats in them. And so I had 2 of those with some butter and coffee, and they were really tasty. All right, so let's dive into the thick of it. Sustainability. Webb Yates is a leader in sustainability in the industry. We are excited to hear you talk about some topics and projects that you've been doing.
So yeah, I know particularly having worked with you guys for a couple of years now, the kind of projects that you guys get stuck into, and I know that in particular on timber and stone, you seem to be leading the way in terms of what the industry is doing and where it's going. So what kind of drives you to work on those kind of solutions?
Well, I think we when I was at, I'm old, so in like 1987 they started talking about global warming widely, although obviously people have known about global warming for maybe 120 years or something. And when I was at college, people were talking about sustainability, and they were talking about timber being a sustainable resource. And we didn't learn anything about timber at university, but it just occurred to me at that point that quite nice to make buildings out of timber. It's a natural material. I think so. We've always been. All the way through my career, I've been pushing to get timber into jobs just because I think it's interesting. It's a little more. Steel is quite, for big complex bridges and stuff, steel is, as difficult as anything else. But for smaller projects, steel is a very, very easy answer. And timber's a bit more challenging, a bit more difficult. And but yeah, we've been promoting that for a long time, and pretty much all the way through our company's existence. And it makes a huge difference to the carbon footprint of what we do. And
yeah, it's a cultural thing that we Steve and Andy, when they started the company, we've always driven quite strong social values through the business, and our staff believe really passionately in trying to do our bit to reduce our carbon footprint. And unfortunately for us as predominantly civil and structural engineers, you know, whilst we also have an MEP department as well, for the civil and structural engineer, being sustainable is a moral choice. It's not a legislative choice, and it's not a choice that's required by BREEAM, because you know you can design the most sustainable structure in the world and you'll get 1 BREEAM credit for it out of 200. It's not worth it. And so, you know, I think our approach to it is that we choose as a company to drive a sustainable model as far as we can within the limits of our clients' budgets and the limits of the sort of building practice and building codes that we work to, and we try and push that throughout the business. And it's a really core part of who we are, and we're trying to avoid moving away from that just because people throw obstacles in our way left, right, and centre on, you know, fire protection and tall building analysis and, you know, risk and availability of materials and all these kind of issues. Ultimately, in 50 years' time, we have to have significantly improved the carbon footprint of the world, really, in terms of, you know, trying to make a change.
Just trying to explore that in a little bit more detail. How do you kind of balance up? You get requirements from a client that say, I want a brand new building, and obviously that comes with a carbon footprint in and of itself. How do you balance that up with your ethos then of driving for sustainability, trying to improve the lives of people around you? How do you kind of weigh up those two considerations?
I think we have a Planeteers group. It's like a group of staff members that get together and talk about sustainability, and they had a really interesting debate recently. And one of the questions that came up in the debate was, should we be working for people who are doing non-sustainable construction? And we were kind of talking it through. So if somebody comes along and says, oh, I want a massive concrete frame, you know, would we do it? And I mean, we debated it, and I don't know, I can't remember what the final conclusion was, but my view on that is like, you know, they're going to build that whether or not we do it. And actually, and this is a terrible parallel, but rather like Tony Blair in the Iraq War, it's better to be inside the room mitigating than it is to have absolutely no influence whatsoever. So I think we try and agitate on all of our projects to go down a more sustainable route. So we'll offer people a reuse alternative or a timber alternative. If they're not buying that, then we'll probably go down a GGBS route. We'll try and design more economically and not be really heavy-handed, and try and convince those clients that it's important. But you really have to tread a fine line, because, you know, most corporate clients, particularly the ones that aren't particularly environmentally friendly, don't want sustainability shoved down their throat at every meeting. So you can pretty quickly alienate them. So it's kind of quite a balancing act. But we've had some successes, and there are places where we haven't had successes, and you know, we build a lot of concrete and steel buildings, so it's not all wood and stone.
So you're engineers and diplomats at the same time.
Well, you know, I think actually, as an engineer, I think engineers, you know, we like to design, and many people in our office are very creative, clever people, and they have really good ideas, but you don't have explicitly very much agency on a design team. You're there to do the numbers to stop the building from falling down, and so you have to, if you want to get an interesting, intrinsically interesting structural solution into a project, or a more sustainable solution, you have to be diplomatic and persuasive. So, for example, everyone in our office goes to sketching boot camp. You know, because if you do a nice sketch of a concept, it's far more likely to fly through the architect, through the client, than if you if you don't have those kind of skills of persuasion.
Do you find as time goes on, people are becoming more open to what your suggestions about more sustainable measures instead of concrete, or are people pretty concrete in there?
I think there's two things that's happening. One is there is far more education around climate and what it means and what the effects are, and as you know, as the climate continues to change, it's becoming more apparent that these effects are there, and so there is more education around our clients. I think one thing I've seen, and I guess this is going to answer your point, Sarah, and part of Daryl's point, is actually the people who hire us often don't have a sustainability agenda. Developers don't often want it, don't often need it. But actually what I'm finding is that the funders do have a sustainability agenda. And so actually, whilst you've got consultants pushing up from the bottom to try and change the way we design, you've also got the funders who are getting a lot of money from young professionals who want to put their money into green investment funds, and therefore our clients who are in the middle between the funders and the engineering teams are getting squeezed about, you know, what are you doing about reducing your embodied carbon on a building? So often, in terms of that being persuasive, we often say to our clients, well, look, you know, here is an alternative design. It is the lowest carbon we think you can get, and here's a comparison between this and maybe what you're asking for. But also, go and talk to your funders, because the biggest problem we have is that we get ignored, or some bits get adopted, and then you get to stage 4 and they want to just secure their funding so they can get the contractor on board and go to site, and then all of a sudden we start getting asked questions about, oh, how could we reduce the carbon of this building now? And you're like, well, it's too late. You know, we can do X, Y, Z, or we go into a full redesign. You're too late. We said at the beginning, go and talk to your funders and see what their expectations were going to be. And I think there's this push down from the financing teams, and there's a push up from the consultants, and there is change happening, but it's slow. It's quite slow and quite painful at times, I think.
Do you think that bottom line cost is going to become less and less of an issue then, when you're looking at the early development of these schemes?
Unless there is a fundamental change in the economics of construction, no, because it's, you know, it's always about, you know, trying to get your net lettable as high as possible, or your areas as high as possible, build as cheaply as you can to maximize your profit. So until there's a fundamental shift in the way that people generate income or see value in their properties, no, I think you will always end up with, unless somebody has a particular social agenda or sustainability agenda, and that's what funds their company, then no, I don't think so. You have to rewrite it from bottom up, I think, to really change things from away from the lowest cost, or we drive sustainable solutions to a point where they are the lowest cost and they're the only ones that make sense. Do you agree, Steve, or do you think there's other things?
I think it's quite, the focus on sustainability has been, until very recently, about energy and use, about building systems and stuff. So air conditioning and heating, and the cost of energy cost of running the building over the long term, when buildings were badly insulated, single glazed, badly serviced, heavily air conditioned things, then the in-use energy cost was massive compared to the embodied carbon. But those things have changed now, and actually, you know, energy in use has reduced quite a lot. If we specify steel frame today, that carbon is going out in the atmosphere tomorrow. If we have a really economic building services system with very low cost, you know, low energy cost air conditioning, that's working across a 40-year period, and in the latter part of that 40-year period, in a decarbonized, heavily decarbonized grid. So it's using a lot of solar power and wind energy at that point in time. But actually, all the legislation and all the financial incentives are for energy in use, and there are particular building control targets for those things. And there are no targets and no benefits in doing something about the embodied carbon. So I think the embodied carbon at this point is far more important than the energy in use for those reasons. And actually, there's no legislation to back that up. So a client sees he has to do something about the energy in use, but the embodied carbon, which I think is much more important, has no advantage to him. But I mean, the other thing is that all the carbon is in the frame and the foundations, and the frame and the foundations is probably 15% of the building cost. Okay. So it's not a massive, and that's the build cost, not the development cost. So maybe the build cost is, I don't know, 60% of the development cost or something. So it's kind of 15% of 60%. And so changes to a frame to make it a timber frame or you know, reduce the foundations or something are pretty marginal in the big picture.
You only look at an impact of 10% of the overall cost of a building, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even, well, yeah, I mean, I think maybe 10, yeah, so 10% is the frame. If the frame costs 20% more because it's a timber frame rather than a steel frame, then it makes a 2% difference.
2% difference overall.
It's like, So who would screw up the planet for 2%?
Absolutely. I think
Plenty
the
of
other thing
people
they need to look at, absolutely.
Definitely.
I think the other thing they need to look at is the carbon impact. The carbon cost is not necessarily here. So if you let's say you went down a route of taxing embodied carbon, where do you tax it? So a lot of steel is produced in Far East or in Europe. So do you tax it at source where the carbon is deposited, or do you tax it at point of use? So do you then tax it in all the developments in London? And I think if you want to drive change from clients, you have to tax it at point of use, potentially, and you would see a huge change in behaviour because it would start affecting people's profitabilities. And maybe that is one way to really drive that change quite quickly.
I mean, another tax, we were writing an article in the Architectural Review the other day about taxation, and specifically that we pay, we tax labour, we don't really tax material. So we pay income tax. So we as designers, just as or builders or whoever, our cost is increased by taxation, whereas material isn't. So there's a kind of tax distortion effect where we will charge less fee and do less design work and put in a slightly fatter, simpler concrete flat slab, because it's in the round, it's more economical to spend money on more material than it is on labour. So particularly in an economy that has a high labour cost and a high taxation cost, if you move that tax from human labour to material, then we would be incentivized to spend a lot more time honing designs. Contractors would put more intricate, lighter weight structures, and so the fiscal system doesn't really support sustainability very well for the reasons that Tom outlined, and that reason. So
I'm sensing from what you're saying that there needs to be a combination of exactly as you described it, Tom, the change in behaviour and interests of investors, but also some legislative changes in order to support that movement, in order to get to a place where ultimately we can produce the most sustainable solutions that we can.
But I don't know. I mean,
Absolutely.
like we've had, the Part L building control thing for the carbon thing happened, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, whatever. Other than that, I don't, the government's going on about sustainability from dawn till dusk, but I haven't seen any kind of legislation that supports the kinds of things that we and many other practices are doing to try to be more sustainable. And in fact, local councils and local governments refuse to accept timber buildings and actually insist on concrete buildings. So not only do you have a total absence of government, and the UK is famously laissez-faire in terms of, in terms of the government interfering in markets, leave it to the market, we'll be building in steel and concrete forever. If it wasn't for the kind of morality of individual practices and people, nobody would do anything. And I think the government needs to, stop talking about all the targets and actually step up and actually do something to make it a bit easier for us to push. All the solutions are there. I don't, no, they will build. I think they'll build a nuclear power station before they'll subsidize a timber plant in the UK. So we have a shortage of CLT and rising timber prices. They would rather build a nuclear power station to decarbonize the energy, which is hugely dangerous and impractical, rather than build a timber plant to reduce the cost of sustainable materials in construction. What would you rather have, a nuclear power station or a timber plant?
Yeah.
I know which I prefer.
Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe maybe a timber plant is bad economics. Maybe nuclear power is good for the GDP.
I think it's about everything around, isn't it? There's the economics of the materials, the labour, as Steve's quite rightly pointed out. There's the taxation on carbon, but also design codes and approved documents of practice are often adjusted in a knee-jerk way to deal with current political problems, rather than being released as a considered set of building documents. If you go and talk to some of the engineers in Europe, they laugh at the UK market and how much steel and concrete we use. They're all talking about doing timber skyrise buildings as the norm, in the next 10 to 15 years. And we are, I think, as an outset towards design and materiality about buildings, we're so far behind Europe on that in terms of our approach to being pragmatic and innovative with those materials and really understanding them.
The French government recently said 50% of government buildings in France should be timber, mandated. As an example of what Tom's saying.
Wow,
and I think, you know, we as a practice has you know, I feel like we're in danger of, you know, kind of being, being maybe being seen as kind of this kind of practice that won't design a building that works unless it's timber, and that's not the case. But I think if we took one of our buildings like Anna Freud Cantor Centre of Excellence, it's a beautiful bit of design. And the reason that is because it's taking materials and using them where they're best. You know, so we've created this timber concrete composite. The concrete slabs between floors are 90 mil thick. They're sized for their fire properties, so they're doing what they need to do and what concrete's good at. You know, they're giving that thermal mass to the MEP so that they can have an openable window solution. You know, but we're only putting 90 mil of concrete in on every floor, not 250 mil, and then we're using the timber where it's really good in terms of its strength and its, and its natural beauty. So you expose the timber, so there's no plasterboard. You expose the underside of the concrete, so there's no plasterboard. You have the timbers spanning something like 7.5 meters at sort of 600 centers, and all of a sudden you're getting a timber building. You're significantly reducing the carbon footprint of that building, and where you need to put the material such as concrete, because we're not saying you're not going to ever use concrete. We're making sure that that concrete is as thin as it absolutely needs to be to do the job it needs to do. And, it's a job that's been a bit of a labour of love for Steve and others within the practice. But it absolutely highlights that it's about putting the right material in the right place, not necessarily a full timber building or a full concrete building or a steel and concrete building. And I think it's really important to kind of rethink the way we put buildings together. And it's about just enough in just the right place, and not necessarily completely banning concrete, not completely banning steel, but it's just about doing the right things at the right time.
Finding that kind of sweet spot and balance. On that point, do you see any changes coming with COVID and the future of how construction's working? Any innovation that maybe clients have asked you to work on, or thoughts that you guys have had in concepts towards making safer workplaces, or how the future of that looks?
I remember when COVID first started, sort of April last year, there was a lot of meetings on a lot of the buildings we were designing about, how do we make this building COVID safe in 3 to 5 years time, whenever that building might be built. And I think by the time people had done the lift analysis and realised that by the time you'd finished making the building COVID safe, you wouldn't have any floor area left, it kind of got parked. And from there's lots of little bits and pieces about surfaces and sanitization and a lot on the MEP about, do you centralize plant equipment so that you're not so recirculating air, and various other things that go with this. In terms of the structural side of things, I've not seen very much in there that's changing for the structural engineer, but definitely for the MEP side of the business, there's lots of talking about, how do you deal with recirculating existing air, and how do you change to a more centralized system. But I suspect, a year on, I'm not necessarily on a lot of the commercial projects that I do. I'm not having conversations about how do we make buildings COVID safe anymore. I think people have kind of accepted that maybe you can't. You can make them better, and you just have to manage the occupancy and you have to manage the airflows. But ultimately, maybe we're better off not building COVID safe buildings. Maybe we're better off improving digital infrastructure, not building housing developments where everybody's sat on top of each other, because there's a lot of developments where COVID's ripped through housing blocks, really caused, a lot of sadness for a lot of people. Why don't we build houses with a bit more space around them so people can work from home, from effective home office spaces? It's that kind of, are you better off doing that than trying to upgrade every office to deal with a pandemic?
Yeah, and that's an interesting conversation as well, too, because it's here to stay. It seems like it's something we're going to be living with forever. So changing the entire structure of how we build buildings to work around something that we're probably going to live with forever doesn't necessarily seem sustainable in the future.
No, and there'll be another pandemic at some point.
Yeah.
With a different virus or a different thing. And the building that you made COVID safe isn't isn't Joe Blogg virus safe in the future? So, how do you predict that? It's a very difficult thing to do.
That's a cheerful thought. Pandemic too.
Absolutely.
Very
Absolutely.
optimistic.
But just on that, have you seen any change in demand going forward in terms of the requirement for commercial office buildings? Maybe it's a little bit too early yet because things were kind of already in the pipeline. But have you seen any impact there in terms of the way in which people are going to work?
We've seen.
From my perspective. Sorry, go on, Steve. You go.
Well, I was going to say, I think we're reasonably busy, and I think office builders are still building offices, and I have to say I'm quite surprised. I think you would think there would be a huge retrenchment in that market, but I guess their gamble is that things will really go back to normal and that rent prices will stay high. Don't know. I'm sure.
I think time will tell.
Well, I mean, in our own case, for example, we would be forced to move office pretty soon because of our staff numbers, but because we're going to go back on a kind of 3 days in, 2 days off pattern, actually the office fits us at a smaller size, which is great for our economics. And I suppose that everyone else is thinking the same thing, and that they were kind of moving towards that anyway.
Exactly the same for us.
Yeah, we've seen that in our own business. We were able to instantly pick up and work from home, and we're doing that for 18 months before we started to go back. So
yeah, so that's got to have. 20% less employees in the office from the demand side has to have an impact on the price of the rental of commercial property. How can it not?
Right.
Absolutely. I think we're already seeing. In one way, we're too early in terms of new offices to say what's happening. But what we are seeing a little bit of at the moment is, people restructuring their offices to facilitate a better flexibility of working space. Reducing the number of permanent desks, maybe increasing the hot desking space. Restructuring kitchens and things, and and redoing their MEP. But actually, these are people as well who maybe were needing to change their lease in their building anyway and move on, and it's conveniently hit with a COVID time. I think time will tell whether there is. I don't know whether there is going to be this permanent change to flexible working. I suspect there will be people who hate it. They want to be in the office day in, day out, and they will continue to be in, and others who will do anything they can to not come back into the office, and they will do the same, and then there'll be everybody in the middle. And depending on what your business is and how that operates, you may or may not get that flexible working to work in an effective manner.
Right, and it can be so varied for every different company. It's really dependent on what it is they do and whether they need to be in the office and how collaboration works. If they're able to do it virtually, as we and yourselves, I'm sure, we're able to do that very easily virtually on videos. We shifted gears pretty quickly, doing our podcast online instead of in the office. So on that note, that was a really insightful conversation. I'd like to wrap it up here because we're just reaching our time limit, but I want to thank you so much, Steve and Tom, for joining us. Where can our listeners get in touch? You have some amazing projects, really, really beautiful projects that we've had a pleasure of helping dig out the innovation side on them. But where can our listeners get in touch with you if they'd like to learn more or connect with you?
Webbyates.com, and there's an email address on there. So we'd be very happy to. And thank you very much for having us.
Follow us on Twitter and Instagram. That's the other thing you can do. That's we're everywhere. Everywhere and nowhere.
Everywhere. We're all over the place. What I'll do is I'll put a link in the description with Twitter, the website, and we'll tag you on LinkedIn as well. I want to thank all of our listeners today for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Construction Big Breakfast. We do have a new episode every 2 weeks, so click that subscribe button, turn your notifications on so you don't miss an episode. And while you're at it, if you have some time, we'd appreciate a 5-star review if you enjoyed this episode today. Please share it, like it, and help spread awareness so that we can reach more listeners. And if you're interested in being a guest on the podcast or looking to collaborate in other ways, visit us at www.invennt.com with 2 N's for the Venn diagram. The link is in the description, or you can fill out a contact form so that one of our team can get in touch. Again, thank you so much, Steve, Tom, Daryl, for joining me today. And it was a pleasure to have you on the podcast. We'll see you next time.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Want to learn more about how Invennt can help your business maximize its bottom line? Head on over to www.invennt.com and get in touch with our team today. Thanks for joining us this week on the Construction Big Breakfast. Make sure to visit our website, www.invennt.com, where you can subscribe to the Construction Big Breakfast on all platforms so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a positive rating. Or if you'd simply share it with a friend, that would help us out too. Be sure to tune in for our next episode.